everyone, welcome to another Writing Support Center workshop. My name is Giselle, and today's topic is subjects, verbs, and clauses, understanding sentence patterns. In this workshop, we will be looking at the different types of sentence patterns that exist, and we will also be talking about the elements needed for every sentence, which are subjects and verbs, along with what subjects and verbs create, which are clauses. So before we begin, I did want to provide some guidelines so that you can get the most out of this workshop. If you haven't already, please be sure to download and complete the accompanying activity worksheet. As we go through this workshop, there will be times where I will pause and ask you to fill out the questions on your worksheet. Doing this will give you a little bit more practice with what we're reviewing during this workshop. There is a document available for download. It is a Word document. If you cannot access a document, you can always email Writing Support Center at pasadena.edu, and we'd be happy to try and send you another version of the file that might work better for you. Additionally, as you go through this workshop, be sure to take your time. One positive of a recorded workshop is that you're able to pause and rewind as you need to. So please don't rush through the workshop. If there are some ideas you need to pause and think about a bit more, feel free to do that. Okay, so for today's workshop, there are a few goals that I have for you as we do go through it. The first one is to define and recognize subjects, verbs, and clauses. So you will learn about what these actually are. I also want you to be able to identify different sentence patterns. And at the end, you will practice differentiating sentence types in your own writing. So if you're currently writing an essay, this would be a good practice session for you. If you've already written an essay or you don't have an essay that you're currently writing, you can draw from previous essays for this activity. So more on that once we get there. So to begin, what are subjects, verbs, and clauses? A subject and a verb are two parts required for a sentence written in English. So this means that every sentence you read has a subject and a verb. When you put a subject and a verb together, that's what creates a clause. Clauses can be either independent or dependent, and I will get into the differences between the two later on in this workshop. So, a little bit more on subjects and verbs. The subject of a sentence shows who or what is doing the action, and that word is usually a noun or a pronoun. So, a noun is a person, place, or thing, and a pronoun is he, she, they. Those would all be considered pronouns. It could also be considered a subject if that's what you're using in the sentence or if someone else is using in the sentence. Some examples of a noun are dog, cat, boy. Those are all very basic examples, and you will see more examples as we go through this workshop. A verb, on the other hand, shows the action or the state of being. So it can be an action verb like run, walk, talk, or a state verb like seem. Is also a state verb, so is can also be considered a verb that is showing the action or state of being. Examples, like I mentioned, are walk, talk, and feel. And a sample sentence that has both a subject and a verb is the dog, subject, ran, verb, through the fence. I will talk about what kind of sentence this is, but for preliminary knowledge, this is a simple sentence, and I will get into what the differences are between the sentence types. What about clauses? So clauses are the third thing I mentioned in the title of this workshop, subjects, verbs, and clauses. And as mentioned, when subjects and verbs are combined, a clause is created. Clauses can be both independent and dependent, and I want to show you what those two different clauses look like. So for an independent clause, a subject and a verb usually make a complete thought. Independent clauses are considered independent because they can stand on their own and are typically complete sentences. So on this page, this sample sentence would be considered an independent clause because it's a complete sentence and it can stand on its own. It does not need support from another clause to make it a complete sentence. On the other hand, a dependent clause is a subject and a verb that don't make a complete thought. So a subject and a verb are present, but the thought isn't complete. It's not a complete sentence. If you put a dependent clause in your essay or in your writing without an independent clause, that would effectively be a fragment, which is an incomplete sentence. Dependent clauses always need to be attached to an independent clause. If not attached to an independent clause, like I mentioned, dependent clauses are considered fragments. So you can have an independent clause on its own. You cannot have a dependent clause on its own as it needs something to support it, which would be an independent clause. One sample sentence: while many people enjoy hiking in the mountains, dependent clause, that's a dependent clause, I prefer taking walks on the beach. That's an independent clause. So the first half of this sentence is a dependent clause because it's not a complete sentence on its own. It would read, while many people enjoy hiking in the mountains. That is not a complete sentence because it's not a complete thought. I'm left here waiting. What else is this person going to say? So you can't have that on its own. It's a dependent clause. Versus the other half of the sentence, I prefer taking walks on the beach. That is a complete sentence. It's a complete thought. You could write it on its own without the first half of the sentence. So to begin with our first activity, you will be looking at 3 sentences, and in those sentences, you're going to identify the subject and verbs along with dependent and independent clauses. You're also going to keep in mind that some sentences might not have a dependent clause, and in that case, you can simply write none on your worksheet. So if you look at activity 1, look at the 3 sentences there and go ahead and take your time to identify which one's a subject or verb and which one's a dependent or independent clause. There is a space where you can type each of these things, so hopefully it's clear enough for where you are identifying each part of these sentences. So go ahead and pause here and fill out that part of the worksheet. All right, I hope you had enough time to do that. I am going to review answers now, so please be sure that you did complete that activity so that you can get the most out of it when you review these answers. So these are the answers for activity 1. For the first sentence, written by Martin Luther King Jr. in the year 1963, letter from Birmingham jail is an open letter King wrote while incarcerated. So here I've marked where the subject and verb are. This sentence is a little tricky because I think a lot of students want to say Martin Luther King Jr. is a subject. But one key thing to remember is the subject is what is doing the action in the sentence. The subject is also the main topic of the sentence. You can think of it that way. So in this case, the subject would be letter from Birmingham jail, because the first part of the sentence is just introducing letter from Birmingham jail, versus letter from Birmingham jail is the meat of the sentence. It's the topic of the sentence, and it's what is doing the action in the sentence. The verb in the sentence is. So letter from Birmingham jail is, again, that is the verb or the state of being for the subject. And again, Martin Luther King Jr. is not the subject because he's not the main topic of this sentence. As for the dependent clause and independent clause, the first half of the sentence is a dependent clause. The reason why is because it cannot stand on its own. If you just take that part of the sentence and read it, that will easily tell you whether or not a sentence is independent or dependent. So, written by Martin Luther King Jr. in the year 1963. That is not a complete thought. It it has me wondering what else is the reader going to say, or the writer going to say, rather. On the other hand, the second half of the sentence, letter from Birmingham jail, is an open letter King wrote while incarcerated. That is the independent clause because it can stand on its own. You could separate it from the first half of the sentence and it would still be fine. Number 2, King directed the letter to 8 white clergymen who had publicly condemned his actions. In this case, it's reversed. The independent clause comes first here, so King directed the letter to 8 white clergymen. That on its own can be a complete sentence. It does not need the dependent clause to stand on its own. On the other hand, who had publicly condemned his actions. This is not a complete thought because I'm wondering who condemned whose actions. It's very unclear as to who is doing what in this sentence, which is why you can think of it as a dependent clause. In this case, King is the subject because he is doing the action, in this case, directed, which is the verb. He is the main topic of the sentence, therefore, King is the subject and directed is the verb. Question 3, King's letter advocates for the abolishment of racial segregation. So there's no dependent clause attached to this sentence. One way that you can tell is there's no comma connecting the two sentences. If there was a comma, it might be attached to a dependent clause, but there is no comma. It is an independent clause and stands alone. King's letter is the subject, so not King, but the letter, because the letter is what is doing the action in this sentence, and the action is advocates, which is the verb. So King's letter advocates for the abolishment of racial segregation. I will be talking about the differences between these sentence patterns because there are different sentence patterns here, and I will talk about that in this next slide, where there are 4 basic sentence patterns. The 4 basic sentence patterns are simple sentence, compound sentence, complex sentence, and compound complex sentence. So a simple sentence to start off is just one independent clause. So for example, Mr. Potato Head eats monkeys. That's an independent clause. It stands on its own. It does not have anything attached to it. It is one single sentence, one single clause. If we look at these examples, this one would be considered, number 3, would be considered a simple sentence because it doesn't have any dependent clauses attached to it. So number 3 is one independent clause, therefore it is a simple sentence. Another type of sentence is a compound sentence. Compound sentences are 2 or more independent clauses. These sentences can be connected using a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Coordinating conjunctions are commonly known as for, and, nor, but, or yet so. This is commonly known as fanboys. It's an acronym that will help you remember these coordinating conjunctions. And again, you use coordinating conjunctions to connect 2 independent clauses. You can also replace a coordinating conjunction with a semicolon and a comma. So that's another option. And I have an example of both of these things below. So for example, Mr. Potato Head eats them for breakfast every day, comma, but I don't see the attraction. Right, so this is referring to the monkeys here. This is going to be one complete paragraph, but Mr. Potato Head eats them for breakfast every day. That's an independent clause, right? It can stand on its own, but it's connected to another independent clause. So that's why there's a comma, but I don't see the attraction. So whenever you use a fanboys coordinating conjunction and a comma, remember that both of those sentences need to be complete sentences on either side. You only use a coordinating conjunction and a comma when both sentences are independent clauses. The second way that you can join 2 independent clauses, like I said, is a semicolon and a comma. So this example, eating them makes him happy. Semicolon, however, he can't persuade me. So this whenever you use a semicolon and a comma, you usually want to use something like however to connect it to the previous sentence. And you usually use a semicolon when the two ideas are closely linked together. This person could have also said, eating them makes him happy, comma, but he can't persuade me. So you can easily replace this semicolon and however with comma and but, one of the fanboys coordinating conjunctions. And again, to remember the coordinating conjunctions for connecting independent clauses, just remember fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet. So any of those words you can connect two independent clauses with a comma. Let me see here. Okay, so neither of these would be considered compound sentences because this is made up of a dependent clause and an independent clause. This is made up of an independent clause and a dependent clause. Again, you need two independent clauses to make a compound sentence. So only these two here are compound sentences. On the other hand, there's another type of sentence called complex sentence. What a complex sentence is one independent clause plus one or more dependent clauses. They can be arranged in these ways, SV because SV, or because SV, comma, SV, or S because SV, comma, V. So this is just a way to show SV stands for the sentence in the beginning or the first part of the clause here, and then the second one. So what this would be, what this would actually look like is, although chicken always appeals to me, comma, I still feel skeptical about monkey. So this comma right here, everything before it is a dependent clause, right? So if we just eliminate the comma, although chicken always appeals to me, it's a dependent clause because it does not stand on its own. And then it's attached to an independent clause, which is what makes it a complete sentence. I still feel skeptical about monkey. The second half of the sentence is an independent clause because it can stand alone. So when you join a dependent clause and an independent clause, it's always going to be a complex sentence. These two here are also complex sentences. So written by Martin Luther King Jr., dependent clause. Letter from Birmingham jail is an open letter King wrote while incarcerated, independent clause. So this would be considered a complex sentence because it ticks the boxes for one independent clause plus one or more dependent clauses. Notice how it says one or more dependent clauses. That means because you can have multiple dependent clauses in a sentence. Mrs. Potato Head, comma, because she loves us so much, comma, has offered to make her special monkey souffle for us. So in this case, this would be the independent clause. Mrs. Potato Head has offered to make her special monkey souffle for us. And this would be the dependent clause because she loves us so much. Again, if you were to eliminate this middle phrase, you would have a complete sentence put together. Mrs. Potato Head has offered to make her special monkey souffle for us. So the commas separate the dependent clause from the independent clause because she loves us so much. Again, cannot stand on its own. It's a dependent clause. So this sentence is a little bit more complicated than this sentence, but this would still be considered just a complex sentence because it has a dependent clause and an independent clause. The next type of sentence is compound complex sentences. This is two or more independent clauses plus one or more dependent clauses. So if you look, this is both a compound sentence and a complex sentence. That's a more simple way to think about it. When you join the two together, you get a compound complex sentence. There's a number of ways that these sentences can be arranged. You can do the subject verb and subject verb because subject verb, or you can do because subject verb, but subject verb. So if you look at this example, Mr. Potato Head said that he would share the secret recipe, semicolon. However, if he does, Mrs. Potato Head will feed him to the piranhas, so we are both safer and happier if I don't eat monkeys or steal recipes. So in this case, this is a little bit more complicated. Mr. Potato Head said that he would share the secret recipe. This one would be considered a complete sentence. Therefore, it is an independent clause. It does not need anything to stand with it. Uh, you could easily put a period here and then have this as its own thing, but this writer chose to connect the two with a semicolon and however. So here we have an independent clause. If he does, Mrs. Piranha Potato Head will feed him to the piranhas. This is another independent clause. So here's our second independent clause. Mrs. Potato Head will feed him to the piranhas. And then here we have the dependent clause. So we are both safer and happier if I don't eat monkeys or steal recipes. The reason why this is a dependent clause is if you delete everything before it, so we are both safer and happier if I don't eat monkeys or steal recipes. The so here makes it makes it so that it can't stand on its own. However, if you do get rid of so, you would have we are both safer and happier if I don't eat monkeys or steal recipes. So then it would be an independent clause. However, if he does, that would be a dependent clause because it does not stand alone. If he does, there's nothing there that helps it stand alone. It is a subject and a verb, but it does not stand alone because it's an incomplete thought. So technically, you have this is an independent clause. So technically you have 3 independent clauses here and 1 dependent clause. So each one of these sentences could be their own sentence and stand alone. This one, however, does not stand on its own, so therefore it's a dependent clause. But because there are 3 independent clauses here, that's what makes it a compound complex sentence, because it requires that 2 or more independent clauses plus 1 or more dependent clause are present. So in this case, a compound complex sentence is a combination of both of these sentences put together. When you write a paragraph, you want to make sure that you're using a combination of these sentences. The reason why is because it provides variation in your paragraphs and it makes the paragraph flow better due to the different types of sentences working together to create that paragraph. So whenever you write, you want to make sure you're writing all types of sentences. You don't want to just stick to compound sentences. You don't want to just stick to simple sentences. You want to make sure you have a little bit of everything in your paragraphs to ensure that you're providing a varied voice and something that flows a little bit better. All right, so for this last activity, you're going to practice identifying sentence types in your own writing. For this activity, you will choose one paragraph from an essay you're currently writing or have written for a course recently. Copy and paste the paragraph into the worksheet. Please be sure to revise any sentences that are run-ons, fragments, or comma splices. If you're not sure how to do that, just do it to the best of your ability. Again, you should be able to practice identifying these sentences. So if there's a sentence in your paragraph that doesn't seem to fit any of these definitions, it might be because it needs to be revised. Again, this is just practice, so it doesn't have to be perfect. Just revise anything that doesn't sound like one of these sentences types. You will then highlight each sentence depending on the kind of sentence it is. You will use these following colors. So in Word, you can use a different type of highlighting for each sentence. For simple sentences, you're going to highlight in yellow. Compound, you will highlight in green. Complex in blue, and compound complex sentences in pink. You can use different colors if you'd like, or you can use a combination of italicizing and or underline. But if you do, please be sure to make a note of that change on the worksheet. So go ahead and do that. Pause here, and once you're ready, continue with the workshop. All right, I hope you had no issues trying to identify those sentences. Of course, if you are still having a hard time, you can always seek out tutoring uh, at the Writing Center to work with a tutor on identifying those sentences or helping you revise any fragments or run ons that you might have in your essay. So, as a recap, we went over subjects and verbs being the essential elements of all sentences. Combining these two things create clauses. Clauses can be either independent or dependent. Dependent clauses cannot stand alone, whereas independent clauses can. There are four basic sentence patterns that we went over, which are simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. As for works cited, the Writing Center at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill has a great handout called Sentence Patterns. You can go to the link I posted here. I will also be putting it in the transcript, so you can go ahead and click on the actual link. If you need more information on how these sentence patterns work, the handout at UNC's website is very helpful and detailed. So if you are someone who likes to read through information, I highly recommend you check out their handout. Uh, that's all I have for now. If you have any other questions about your writing, again, please feel free to seek tutoring at the Writing Support Center. I wish you the best of luck on your work in your classes and a good rest of your semester. Hopefully, we see you at another workshop.